I have been awake for 11 hours, which is nothing. I have been awake for 11 years, which is closer to the truth. I am recording this because the ship's log has been silent for 6 months, since Pinder died and nobody thought to keep it running, and someone should say what happened out here. Someone should say it plainly, even if the only ears it ever reaches belong to people who aren't born yet. That's what we always told ourselves. That was the whole point. My name is Graham Edge. I am 61 years old by Earth reckoning, though I stopped counting after the first decade because the math became depressing. I am the last surviving member of the original crew of the generation ship Threshold. I am sitting on the bridge of a vessel that launched from the ruins of what used to be Australia 79 years ago, with 4,312 human beings aboard, and I am going to tell you what we learned about the things called the Watchers and what it cost us, and why it was worth it. The children will decide whether to believe me. That's the other thing we always told ourselves. The children will decide. Let me start with what they were, because most people who survived long enough to hear about the Watchers got their information secondhand, filtered through panic and distance, and panic and distance are bad lenses. The Watchers were not what we expected. When we first encountered them, when humanity first encountered them, 30 years before Threshold launched, the consensus from every military and scientific body still functioning on Earth was that they were a weapon, a constructed thing, an instrument of something larger, something we hadn't yet found. We spent 8 years looking for the species that had built them, the hand that pointed them at us, the reason behind the pattern of their attacks. We never found it. We never found it because there was no larger species. The Watchers were the largest thing in this part of the galaxy, and they had been the largest thing for approximately 200 million years, and the reason they came for Earth when they did was almost laughably mundane. They had detected our radio transmissions, analyzed them over 6 decades, determined that we were becoming capable of self-sustaining interstellar travel, and decided, with the cold, flat logic of something that had been watching stars burn and die since the dinosaurs walked, that a second spacefaring species in this region was not acceptable. They were not evil. That took us a long time to understand. Evil requires preference, and preference requires something like feeling, and the Watchers felt nothing. They were enormous distributed intelligences built from crystalline matrices the size of continents, spread across 17 planetary bodies in what we now call the Threshold system. They communicated in vibration and light burst, in sequences of such mathematical elegance that our linguists wept the first time they decoded them, not from awe but from the sudden understanding that there was no word in any human language for what these things were. We had words for cold. We had words for ancient. We had words for vast. We did not have a word for a mind that experienced the death of a star as a minor data point in a continuous record that stretched back before complex life existed on Earth. They were not malicious. They simply calculated. They had watched other species before us. We found the records later, those long, cold catalogs of civilizations noted and then erased, and the calculation was always the same. A second interstellar species introduces variables. Variables introduce instability. Instability is inefficient. The solution was always the same. They were very, very good at the solution. I was 22 when the first Watcher vessels reached the inner solar system. I say vessels, but that's not quite right. They were more like extrusions, pieces of something larger pushing through, the way a hand pushes through a curtain. The mathematics of their transit drive were so far beyond our physics that our best minds could only observe and record, unable to even frame the right questions. They came in 7 of these extrusions, each one roughly the mass of a small moon, and within 4 months they had ended organized resistance on Earth. Not by bombing, not by anything so comprehensible as bombing. They simply altered the magnetosphere in a specific way, using a process we still don't fully understand, and every electrical system on the planet stopped working. Everything. All of it simultaneously, without fire or explosion, without a crater or a body or a shockwave. The lights went out, the grid went down, the engine stopped, and then they waited, with the patience of things that measure time in stellar cycles, for the resulting collapse to run its course. 6 billion people, 93% of the population, not killed by the Watchers, killed by what happened when you removed electricity from a civilization that had built itself on the assumption that electricity was permanent. Hospitals, food distribution systems, water treatment, climate control in regions where the temperature without it was not survivable. The chain of consequence unspooled with a terrible logic, each link following the next, and nothing we could do from the ground, those of us who survived the first weeks, those of us in the communities that had independent power or were remote enough to have never been on the grid, nothing we could do slowed it. We could only watch and endure and try to figure out what happened next. I don't talk about that part often. I was in the Daintree recovery settlement when the final collapse came to the coast, one of the inland communities that had been running on a hydroelectric system that kept functioning for another 6 weeks after the grid went down. I watched the sky go dark over the coast. I watched the fires start, distant at first, then close enough that we could see individual flames. I watched for 3 days before the settlement's council decided we needed to stop watching and start building walls. I am 61 years old and I still watch those fires when I close my eyes, and I do not intend to describe them further here. Some things should be allowed to remain personal. The Watchers did not land. They did not negotiate. They did not send envoys or ultimatums. They monitored the collapse for 11 months, and then they returned to their system, and that was the last any surviving human saw of them for 9 years. 9 years was exactly what the Threshold project needed. I want to be honest about Threshold because it deserves honesty. It was not a noble thing at first. It was a desperate thing. The 400 people who designed it in those first years in the Daintree settlement and then later at the Cape York facility when we'd rebuilt enough to have a facility were not thinking about children's children. They were thinking about survival. They were thinking about getting enough humans far enough away that the Watchers wouldn't bother following. They were thinking, with the cold practicality of people who had watched most of the species die, that the only calculation that mattered was distance. Justin Hayward, our chief engineer, not a name you'd expect on a chief engineer, but then nothing about those years was what you'd expect. Justin said it cleanly in the first planning session I attended. He said, "We are not saving humanity. We are saving the possibility of humanity. It is not the same thing. Don't confuse yourself by thinking it's the same thing." I was 26. I had never built anything larger than a radio transmitter. I had no family left. I had a set of practical skills that the committee deemed useful, and a tendency to say what I thought in situations that called for careful silence, which Justin said would either be an asset or a disaster depending on the day. He brought me on as crew coordinator, which meant I was responsible for selecting, training, and managing the roughly 4,000 people who would make the journey. 4,000 out of what remained, which was somewhere between 60 and 80 million, depending on which settlement census you believed and how recently they'd updated it. 4,000. That number sits differently in the gut when you stood in front of the lists and had to decide. We had criteria, age, health, skill set, psychological profile, but the criteria could never fully account for the fact that the people who didn't make the list were not less human than the people who did. They were simply not who we had room for. I made peace with that eventually. Mostly. You make peace with what you have to make peace with, or you stop functioning, and stopping functioning was not an option. We launched 81 years ago. The Threshold was not a beautiful ship. It was functional and enormous, and it smelled like recycled air and machine oil, and the particular human staleness of too many people in too little space. And it shook badly during the first 3 months of acceleration, because we'd had to use a secondary oscillation dampener after the primary failed during the final systems check. And we didn't have a replacement because we'd used every replaceable component we had just to get to launch day. But it flew. It climbed out of the gravity well on a cold, clear morning, the last clear morning I remember on Earth, and I stood on the observation deck with 200 other people and watched Australia get small, and then smaller, and then disappear into the blue curve of the planet, and nobody spoke for a long time. John Lodge was standing next to me. John was our life systems lead, responsible for the biomes and the growing chambers and the water reclamation, and he had a wife named Kara and a daughter named Ellen who was 3 years old and asleep in the family quarters below us. He looked at that shrinking blue sphere for a long time, and then he said, quietly, "I never thought I'd live to see this." And then, after a moment, "I'm not sure I wanted to." I understood what he meant. There's a particular grief in surviving long enough to see the thing that should never have been necessary become necessary. We weren't pioneers in the romantic sense. We were refugees. The distinction matters. The first 9 years were manageable. That's the word I'd use. Not easy, not pleasant, but manageable. We had problems, the bacterial bloom in Biome 7 that wiped out 6 months of crop growth, the cascade failure in the water reclamation system on level 3, the running conflict between 2 of the engineering factions over resource allocation that I spent the better part of a year mediating. Human problems. The kind that have human solutions if you have the patience and the willingness to sit in a room with people who are furious at each other and not leave until something's been resolved. I had both. Barely, some days, but I had them. There were also quieter difficulties, the ones that don't appear in official logs. The grief that moved through the ship in waves, unpredictable, triggered by nothing obvious and devastating when it arrived. A smell from the recycled air that someone thought for a moment was rain. A particular angle of the ship's interior lighting that looked, briefly, like afternoon sun through a window. We were all carrying the same weight in our own private ways, and the weight was this. We had left and we were not going back, and the thing we had left was gone. The grief wasn't clean. It had no ritual, no community of mourning that shared the same specific losses. Each person's grief was slightly different from every other person's grief, and the sheer variety of it meant that sometimes the person standing next to you could not be any comfort at all, because they were mourning something that didn't overlap with your mourning in a way that allowed connection. We learned to be careful with each other about this. We learned that there were questions you didn't ask unless you knew someone very well, and spaces you gave people without requiring explanation, and that sometimes the most useful thing you could do for another person was simply to be present without speaking. A ship of survivors develops its own etiquette of shared loss. Mike Pinder was the one who articulated it best. Mike ran our signals division, communications, navigation, the long-range detection systems, and he was, of all the crew, the one who spent the most time alone in the dark with the instruments, watching the stars move at the pace of things that are very far away. He told me once, around year 15, that he had developed a practice. When the grief came, he didn't try to manage it or redirect it. He sat with the telescope and he looked at the oldest light he could find, the light from things so distant that it had been traveling since before Earth existed, and he let himself understand that everything he was mourning was itself old light, real while it burned, real in the record of having burned, present in consequence even when the source was gone. He said it didn't make the grief smaller. He said it made the grief feel proportionate. Like something that fit correctly into the scale of things, rather than something that was going to swallow him. I tried it once. I'm not sure I got the same result Mike got, but I understood what he was reaching for, and I think the reaching itself was the point. You find the practice that keeps you upright. You pass it on when you can. Mike died in year 73. Quietly in his quarters, with the telescope display running and the oldest light he could find on the screen. We found him in the morning looking like a man who had decided to stop and rest. The log he kept for the navigation division was meticulous and complete, and contained, in the margin of one final entry, A three-word note that nobody could quite interpret and everybody understood. Still worth watching. The children were what changed things. Not immediately, not dramatically. But they were there, and they grew, and they were different from us in ways that I didn't have language for until much later. Ellen Lodge was the first child born on Threshold, in the second year of flight. She was followed, over the next decade, by several hundred others, the first full generation of people who had no memory of Earth, who had never stood on soil or felt rain, or seen a horizon that wasn't a curved steel wall. They learned about these things from us, from lessons and recordings, and the careful tended memory of the adults who had survived. They received this knowledge with the intense seriousness of children who understand instinctively that they are being handed something precious, something that can be dropped and broken and cannot be replaced. They were also, I noticed, watching us, with the particular patient attention of young minds that are still learning what the world is. They watched the adults around them and tried to understand what had been done, and why, and what it meant for them. And when they were old enough to ask, they asked. They asked with an honesty that adults lose somewhere in the process of learning to be polite, and the questions were sometimes very hard to answer. Ellen Lodge asked me once when she was about 9 years old why we had left. Not how. Why. She knew the how, she'd had the lessons, she understood the technical facts of the collapse and the launch. She wanted to know why we had done it this way, why escape rather than fight, why flee rather than stay and endure. I told her what Justin had said, that we were saving the possibility, that we couldn't save the thing itself, only the possibility. She thought about this for a moment, with the grave, focused expression she always wore when she was working something out. Then she said, "But the possibility isn't any good to us if we don't do anything with it." I didn't have an answer for that. I thought about it for weeks afterward. I still think about it. It is, as far as I'm concerned, the most important question anyone on this ship ever asked, and it was asked by a 9-year-old, which is perhaps appropriate. Children have not yet learned that certain questions are supposed to be rhetorical. The Watchers found us in the 37th year of flight. I don't know how. We'd been running silent for a decade, no significant emissions, nothing that should have been detectable at the distances involved. The working theory, which Ray Thomas developed before he died, and which our current science team still holds as most likely, is that they weren't looking for us specifically. They were conducting a routine survey of the transit corridor between the inner and outer systems, and Threshold crossed through a monitoring region, and they simply noticed us the way a very large organism notices a splinter. Not a significant splinter, not an alarming splinter, just a thing that shouldn't be there, registered and flagged for follow-up. The follow-up was what we'd been afraid of for 37 years. The first indication was a shift in the background radiation readings. Then the long-range optical sensors registered something at the edge of their range, something that shouldn't have been there. Then the frequency analysis came back, and Ray Thomas came and found me in my quarters at 3 in the morning, and he stood in the doorway with the look of a man who had run out of ways to make bad news sound like anything other than bad news. Ray was, by that point, one of my oldest friends aboard the ship. He had been born in what used to be Edinburgh, trained as a physicist, retrained as a linguist during the collapse years, because the settlement needed language skills more than it needed particle physics. And then retrained again as a communications specialist for the Threshold project, because it turned out that particle physics was more useful than we'd thought when designing the detection systems. He was 53 years old that morning, and he had the particular quality of stillness that he always had when something was wrong and he had already decided how to handle it. Not calm, exactly. Stillness is different from calm. Calm suggests the absence of fear. Ray wasn't afraid, exactly. He had simply placed the fear somewhere it wasn't currently accessible, so that he could function. He told me what the readings showed. He told me what they probably meant. He told me the trajectory estimate and the intercept calculation, and he said the number 4 months in a voice that was careful and even and gave nothing away. I said, "Does anyone else know yet?" He said, "You're the first person I've told." I said, "Give me an hour." He nodded and went back to his station, and I sat in my quarters for an hour and thought, and then I called the senior staff meeting, and we told the rest of the ship that morning. Because that was the rule we had made at the beginning. No holding bad news to protect people. Everyone deserved to know what they were facing. The ship had always operated on that principle, and we were not going to abandon it at the moment it was most difficult to honor. The extrusion was smaller than the ones that had come to Earth. A scout, probably, by the logic of the thing, a limb rather than a hand. It was still the size of a small moon. It was still moving on a trajectory that would intercept us in approximately 4 months. We had a vote. That was always how Threshold made its significant decisions, from the beginning, because Justin had argued, correctly, I think, that a ship full of people who had no say in their own fate would eventually be a ship full of people who didn't bother to do their jobs. We had built genuine governance structures, messy and slow and genuinely democratic, and when something mattered enough, we voted. The question we voted on, that long, awful week, was whether to try to run or to try to talk. Running was the rational choice. We had enough reaction mass for one major course change, possibly 2 if we were careful. The Watcher extrusion was large, but we had analyzed what we could of its drive signature, and our best estimate was that we were comparable in maximum velocity, possibly slightly faster over short distances. We might outrun it. We might buy ourselves another decade, another 20 years, enough to reach the target system and begin whatever came next. Running was what we had been built to do. Talking was John Lodge's idea, and when he proposed it, most of the senior crew looked at him the way you look at someone who has just suggested something that cannot possibly work. John was normally the calmest and most practical of us. He'd spent 37 years keeping 4,000 people alive through 17 significant crises, and he was not a romantic and he was not reckless. When he said we should try to talk, people listened, because John Lodge did not say things he hadn't thought through. His argument was this: we had spent 37 years believing that the Watchers couldn't be reasoned with because they didn't reason the way we did. We had assumed that incomprehensibility went both ways. But what if it didn't? What if they had been watching us as they did everything? And what if they had been puzzled by something they'd observed? Not moved by it, not troubled by it, puzzled by it in the way that a calculating intelligence is puzzled by a variable it can't account for. What if that gave us something to work with? I asked him, "What do you think they've observed?" He said, "Us. What we're doing. The thing we're doing right now, the whole project. They've watched us for 37 years doing something that makes no rational sense to them, and I think that matters." The vote was close. We voted to try to talk, and then we talked. The communication took 11 weeks, and it was the most exhausting and the most extraordinary work I have ever witnessed. Ray Thomas and his team, he was our linguist as well as our physicist, one of those infuriating people who are brilliant at everything they touch. Ray and his team worked from the mathematical signaling protocols that had been developed back on Earth before the collapse, improved and refined over 3 decades of analysis of intercepted Watcher communications. They sent pulses. They received responses. They built, layer by layer, the most basic possible shared vocabulary, a pigeon of mathematics and frequency bursts that reduced all possible meaning to the most elementary elements. The Watchers were patient. That at least worked in our favor. They were not in a hurry. They never were. They signaled back with the calm regularity of something that had all the time in the universe, which they essentially did, and they corrected our errors precisely and without apparent frustration, and they provided no indication whatsoever of what they intended to do with us. I watched those sessions. I sat in on as many as I could manage, though the technical work was far beyond my ability to contribute to directly. What struck me, sitting in that room night after night, was the quality of attention on both sides. Ray and his team leaning forward over their instruments with the focused intensity of people who know that every word matters, and on the receiving end, what the Watchers were doing on their side of that exchange, I can only guess. but they kept responding. They kept engaging. Something about the fact of our communication held their attention, and held it across 11 weeks, and that was more than we'd had any right to expect. At the end of 11 weeks, Ray came to the full crew meeting with a translation of the longest coherent statement the watchers had transmitted. He read it aloud in the meeting hall. 312 people crowded in, the rest listening on the ship's internal broadcast. The statement was this: "You are traveling away from your origin. You cannot return. You travel toward a destination you will not survive to reach. You carry others who may survive to reach it. This is not rational behavior. Please explain." The hall was very quiet for a long time. Ray said, "They don't understand it, what we're doing, why we're doing it. They've watched species before, they have never seen this." Someone in the back of the hall, I didn't see who, said, "What did they mean, we won't survive to reach it?" And Ray said, with the careful precision he always used when he had bad news to deliver, they weren't talking about the journey. They meant the Watcher extrusion that was now 6 weeks behind us and matching our velocity exactly. They meant they were going to kill us. They were asking us to explain our behavior before they did. I remember the sound of that room. Not panic, something more complicated than panic. The sound of people recalculating in real time everything they thought they had understood about their situation. People had assumed, in the way that humans protect themselves from the worst possibilities by not fully engaging with them, that the talking would work. That if we were talking, we were probably not going to die. The statement stripped that protection away, gently, with the complete indifference of something that was simply providing accurate information. I remember Ellen Lodge, who was 46 years old and the head of our biological sciences division, and the mother of 3 children and the grandmother of 1, standing up from her seat and saying, in a voice that carried all the way to the back, "Then we explain it." There was a silence. She said, "They asked. They've never asked before. They're asking because they don't understand it and they need to understand it before they proceed, so we explain it." Justin Hayward, who was in his 80s by then and spent most meetings sitting down because standing hurt his back, but who was still present at everything that mattered, Justin said, "How do you explain something to something that doesn't feel?" Ellen said, "You don't explain it in terms of feeling. You explain it in terms of logic. You explain it in terms of what we're maximizing for. They understand optimization. Every mind that reasons understands optimization. You just have to tell them what the variable is." The message we sent back took 4 days to compose. It was 3 sentences in the Watcher pidgin, which meant it took 4 days to encode correctly because precision in that language mattered the way surgical precision matters, a single error in a variable, and the meaning collapsed entirely. Ray's team checked it 17 times. They argued about individual elements for hours. There was a 2-day dispute over the correct mathematical symbol for a value that was separate from the entity that held it, a concept for which the Watcher pidgin had no established term, and which they had to construct from first principles. When it was finally ready, Ray looked at it for a long time before he sent it. The 3 sentences were: "We travel for those who come after us. We will not survive to see the outcome. We have calculated that the outcome justifies the cost." We sent it, and then we waited. The response came in 8 hours, which was fast by Watcher standards. The fastest they had ever responded to anything. Ray decoded it in his quarters, and then he came and found me, for the second time in this story, in the early hours of the morning, and he stood in the doorway, and this time his face was not the face of a man delivering bad news. The response was, "This is not possible. A system does not accept the termination of its own processes in exchange for improvements to a successor system it cannot verify and will not observe. This contradicts the fundamental logic of self-continuation. Please clarify." They thought we were lying, or they thought we had made a mathematical error. The concept, the actual concept of doing something for people you will never meet, of accepting your own death so that strangers who don't exist yet might have a better chance. They had computed it, and the output didn't make sense, so they concluded the input must be wrong. Ray said to me, "They've been watching civilizations for 200 million years. They have never seen this. Either no other species has ever done it, or no other species has ever explained it to them in terms they could process. Either way, they don't have a category for it. It's breaking their model." I said, "Is that good or bad?" Ray said, "I think it might be the most useful thing that has ever happened to us." What followed was 6 months of the most intricate and consequential conversation in human history, and I was present for most of it, though Ray and Ellen and the team did the actual work. I sat in on the sessions and made coffee, which was one of the things I was still good for at 61, and I watched two humans try to explain to an alien intelligence the concept of sacrificing yourself for your children's children's children. It was not easy. The watcher kept returning to the same objection. The math didn't work. From the perspective of any self-regulating system, you don't spend your own continuity to purchase an outcome you can't observe. The return on investment cannot be calculated because the investor doesn't survive to receive the return. The behavior was, by any rational framework the watcher possessed, a malfunction. They tried biology first. The mathematics of kin selection. The evolutionary logic of an organism accepting reduced fitness to improve the fitness of its genetic relatives. The watcher engaged precisely, worked through the calculations, and then pointed out that the relationship between the original crew and the unborn generations we were working to preserve was too attenuated, the genetic connection too diluted across time, to satisfy the kin selection model at the magnitudes we were claiming. The math didn't extend that far. You could justify sacrifice for your children. The numbers did not support sacrifice for your children's children's children by anything like the same logic. They tried game theory, the long-form calculus of civilizational cooperation, the argument that a species which acts on extended time horizons demonstrates a kind of reliability that makes it a more stable component of any system it inhabits. The watcher worked through this methodically, agreed that the argument was structurally sound for shorter time horizons, and then asked a question that stopped the session for 2 days. If the extended time horizon is what justifies the sacrifice, then what justifies the extended time horizon? There had to be something at the base of the chain that was not itself justified by something further. What was it? Ellen was the one who found the angle that worked. It took her 3 months. She tried a dozen approaches, each one mapped carefully to the watcher's framework, each one failing at the same point. The moment when the sacrifice exceeded what could be justified by calculable benefit to the individual or their immediate genetic continuity. Then Ellen said in session, to nobody in particular, just thinking out loud, "The problem is that we're trying to explain it as a survival strategy. It's not a survival strategy. It's a value." And she turned to Ray and said, "Ask them if they have a concept of a value that exists independently of the entity that holds it." Ray said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Ask them if they believe that the mathematical principles they operate on would continue to be true even if they ceased to exist. Not whether they believe they would cease to exist. They don't entertain that. Ask if the principles are real independent of the entity that uses them. Is mathematics true because they compute it, or does it exist outside of them?" Ray looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, slowly, "You're asking whether they believe in anything that is true beyond themselves." Ellen said, "I'm asking whether they have the concept of something that transcends the individual system, whether they can imagine a value that is real even if no one is there to hold it." Ray composed the query very carefully, and they sent it. The watcher response came 6 hours later, which was fast. Ray decoded it over the course of a day, cross-checking each element with 3 different members of the team. Then he read it to the assembled senior staff, and the reading took 2 hours, because the transmission was long and dense, and required continuous annotation to be comprehensible to non-specialists. The condensed version is this. The Watchers had never considered the question. In 200 million years of continuous operation, they had never needed to, because they had never imagined their own cessation. They were so old and so large and so distributed that the concept of their own extinction was not merely unlikely, but genuinely outside their normal processing parameters. It was like asking a mountain if it had ever considered what would happen if mountains no longer existed. The question was novel to them, in a way that almost nothing had been novel to them in geological time. They considered it for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, the extrusion that had been following us maintained its distance exactly, not closing, not withdrawing, waiting, with the patience of something that had measured time in eons and found the concept of 3 weeks essentially instantaneous. We waited too. We did not talk about it much, those 3 weeks. People did their work, maintained their routines, ate and slept and looked after their children with the focused intention of people who have decided that the only thing they can control is how they spend the time in front of them. I walked the corridors at night and looked at the families in the common areas, the old people and the young ones and the children running between tables, and I thought about what Ray had said. They don't have a category for this. What we're doing is outside their model. And the thing that was outside their model was not some military capability or technological advantage. It was simply the fact of all of this. The fact that John Lodge had left Earth knowing he would never see it again, and had been growing food for 4,000 people for 37 years, and was going to keep doing it until he couldn't, because his daughter needed a world to grow up into, and he intended to provide one. The Watchers responded, and what they said was, if your principles exist independently of your existence, then the termination of your existence does not terminate your principles. Your principles would continue to operate in your successors. This is a form of continuity that our model did not contain. We are updating the model. The room was silent for a long moment. Then someone asked Ray what that meant in practical terms, and Ray said, carefully, that it appeared to mean that the Watchers had found a category error in their own logic. They had always assumed that the relevant unit of analysis was the individual entity or species. They had never accounted for the possibility that a value, a principle, a way of being, a love, could be more durable than the entity that held it. And that this possibility, now that they had considered it, changed the calculus of what it meant to eliminate us. Because if our values outlasted us, then the elimination of our bodies was not the elimination of the thing that was actually interesting about us. And interesting, to something that had watched 200 million years of civilizations come and go, was perhaps the most significant category it had. It took 4 more months of careful negotiation to establish every parameter of what had been decided. Ray and Ellen and the team working 18-hour days, mapping the boundaries, testing each term in the growing shared language, making certain that what they understood to have been agreed was what had actually been agreed. The Watcher was, in this, completely reliable. It had decided something, and it held to what it had decided with the same cold consistency with which it held to everything. That at least was something we could work with. The extrusion withdrew, and before it withdrew, it transmitted a set of navigational coordinates that turned out to be a region of the threshold system that contained a planetary body, rocky, cool, within the habitable zone of its star, that the Watchers had flagged in their records as meeting all the criteria a biological civilization would require for colonization. They gave us a planet. That's the simple version. The complex version is that they added humanity to the model in a new category, a category that had previously been empty, a category that their logic had never had occasion to construct, entities whose behavior cannot be predicted by individual survival calculus, entities that act on principles that outlast themselves. And their model, updated, indicated that the extermination of such entities introduced a larger instability than their continued existence, because you can predict an entity that only acts in its own interest. You cannot predict an entity that acts in the interest of something it will never see. They decided we were more interesting than we were dangerous. We were more interesting because we didn't make sense. That is, as far as I can determine, the most human thing that has ever saved us. There was something else in that final Watcher transmission, something that took Mara, not yet born at the time, but who reviewed the raw logs years later, to identify fully. Embedded in the mathematical structure of the message, visible only when you analyze the harmonic relationships between the signal elements rather than the denotative content, was a pattern that Mara described as something between a question and a notation. It wasn't part of the message. It was something running alongside the message, in the same way that a musician's hand might tap a rhythm unconsciously while they're focused on something else entirely. Mara decoded it as, "Why does it not diminish?" She brought this to me in a note, 4 years after the settlement began, asking if I had any interpretation to offer. I sat with the question for a while. Then I wrote back, "I think they're asking why love doesn't get smaller when you extend it further. Why it doesn't thin out over time and distance and generations until there's nothing left. I think they've observed that it doesn't, and they don't have a model for why." Mara wrote back in about an hour, "Did you give them an answer?" I didn't, I told her. I didn't have one that would translate. Some things you can describe mathematically, and some things you can only demonstrate by doing them for 79 years, and letting whatever is watching draw its own conclusions. The planetary survey took 2 years. The Watcher extrusion remained in the system, at a distance, not communicating, simply present, watching as they always watched. Our survey teams, working in the 3 small craft threshold carried, confirmed what the coordinates had indicated. The planet was real. The conditions were within survivable parameters, close enough to what humans needed that the biome engineering team said, with the particular careful optimism of people who have been disappointed before, that it was possible, that it could work, that with time and patience and the application of every tool we had, this place could become the thing we had needed it to be. I was not part of those survey missions. I was 63 years old and my knees had stopped cooperating, and the truth is that I had spent 40 years managing and coordinating and keeping things together, and I did not entirely trust myself not to break something important in a small survey vessel. My contribution, at that stage, was to sit in meetings and ask questions that other people found annoying but which occasionally turned out to matter. John Lodge died in the 3rd year of the survey. He'd been carrying a cardiac arrhythmia for a decade that he hadn't told anyone about, because John was that kind of man, the kind who carries things quietly until he can't, who believes that worry shared is worry multiplied, and who does not always account for the fact that sometimes other people would like the chance to carry the weight with you. His daughter Ellen was with him. He died in the medical bay in no pain, with the window facing the target planet, which was just barely visible as a point of light at that distance. His granddaughter, 18 months old, the first child of the next generation, was in the bed beside him, placed there by Ellen because she thought it would help, and she was right. John's last coherent statement, which Ellen wrote down and read to the full crew at the memorial 3 days later, was, "I never thought I'd live to be 1,000,000. That was his way, John's way. A quiet joke when the weight got too heavy, a deflection that was also, somehow, an acknowledgement. He had survived and built and endured beyond anything he'd thought possible, and he was leaving with the knowledge that what he'd built was going to outlast him by a very long time, and that was the thing he'd been working toward all along." I thought about what he'd said for a long time afterward. I thought about how 80 years ago, in the early days of Threshold, that had been a line spoken in bittersweet irony. "I never thought I'd live to be 100. I never thought I'd live to be 1,000,000, meaning the scale of what we'd taken on was almost incomprehensible, and how, in the end, it had turned into something else, a statement of fact. An accounting of what had been survived and what had been built and what was now, against every reasonable expectation, going to continue. We didn't land. That's the part that people always want to know when they hear this story secondhand. Did you land? And the answer is no. Threshold was never built to land. It was built to carry and then to orbit, to be the platform from which actual settlement could begin. The colonization vessels, smaller, lighter, built over the course of 20 years by the engineering teams in the ship's fabrication bays, those were what would take the next generation down to the surface. We're taking them, by the time I'm recording this, have taken some of them already. I am not among those who descended. I made the decision, 2 years ago, that I would stay aboard Threshold while it remained operational. Someone needs to. The ship will continue to function as a communications hub and emergency resource for the surface teams, and it will need crew, and I am the last of the original crew, and it seemed right that one of us should be here until there are enough of them down there to no longer need us up here. Justin Hayward made the same decision, and a different one. He went down because he had always said he wanted to stand on real ground before he died, and at 93 with his back the way it was, the window for that was closing. He lasted another year on the surface, long enough to see the first permanent structure completed, long enough to stand in actual soil and look at an actual sky. He died in that structure on a cot, with a window open to the alien air. His last words, according to the nurse who was present, were, "Well, that'll do." That was Justin. 60 years of doing what needed doing, and at the end, the same flat assessment he'd have applied to a successful test of a secondary propulsion system. Adequate. Mission accomplished. Moving on. Ray Thomas went down 2 years before Justin. Ray was 78, and his eyesight was going, and he was still doing spectral analysis with instruments that had been repaired and repaired and repaired, until they were held together more by habit than engineering, and he went down to the surface to set up the planet's first permanent observatory. He is still alive, as of my last communication, age 81, directing the survey of the planet's second continent from a base camp that he admits is extremely uncomfortable but which has, he says, extraordinary seeing conditions. He sent me a note last month that ended with, "They're still watching. So are we. I think we're going to be fine." Ellen Lodge is 47 years old, and she is standing, right now, in a field of something that looks approximately like grass, in the planet's northern hemisphere, watching a group of children build something from materials they found in the nearby riverbed. Her daughter, whose name is Asha, is 12. Asha has never been aboard Threshold. She was born on the surface in the 3rd year of settlement, and she has never once in her life breathed recycled air or felt the particular vibration of a generation ship's drive systems through the soles of her feet. She is, as far as I know, growing up fine. Stubborn, according to Ellen. Interested in everything. Not particularly interested in history, which Ellen says with the specific combination of exasperation and relief that parents develop when they realize their children are going to be their own people regardless of what the parents had in mind. There will come a time when Asha wants to know the history. There always does, and the record will be there. That's why I'm recording this. The Watchers are still present in the system. Not intrusively, they have maintained their distance throughout the settlement, and there has been no further contact beyond a single brief exchange 6 months after landfall in which they transmitted what Mara, the 26-year-old physicist who has inherited Ray's role and Ray's instruments and Ray's habit of sending messages at 3 in the morning, Mara translated as something approximately equivalent to, "Acknowledged. We continue to observe." We told them we know. They have been watching us for 79 years now. They have watched us launch from a dying planet and fight through equipment failures and biological crises, and the ordinary daily grinding difficulty of keeping 4,000 people alive in a metal container for 8 decades. And they have watched us, in the middle of all of that, raise children and teach them things and love them past the point of what any reasonable calculation of self-interest would support. They watched a man named John Lodge spend his last conscious hours next to an 18-month-old child, choosing that over any other use of his remaining time. They watched Justin Hayward spend his 90s in pain, doing engineering work he didn't have to do, because it needed doing and nobody else had the specific knowledge he had, and the people who would benefit from that knowledge weren't born yet. I don't know what they make of it. Their model has been updated, but models don't feel, and I'm not naive enough to think that 200 million years of cold calculation becomes warm just because one fleet of human refugees gave them a data point they couldn't account for. They watch. They observe. They have, as far as we can determine, made no moves to resume the extermination protocol. Whether that is permanent or temporary, whether there is some future calculation that returns the same old output, whether our descendants' will stand in the same position we stood in 70 years ago, I don't know. I can't know. What I know is that we bet on the children's children's children. We bet that what we were carrying was worth preserving even at the cost of the carriers. We bet that a value, a principle, a love, a specific human way of being in the universe, stubborn, irrational by certain measures, inclined to endure, was real enough and durable enough to persist past the people who held it, to take root in soil we would never stand on, in the lives of people who would never know our names, and to become something that would eventually look up at an alien sky and decide what to do next. We won the bet so far. Threshold is quieter than it has ever been. There are 11 of us left aboard. Most of the ship systems run automatically now, and the parts that don't run automatically are maintained by the 4 engineers who are staying on rotation until the surface settlement can support itself entirely, which Mara estimates will be in another 3 years. The corridors that used to carry 4,000 people now carry 11, and the sound of it is strange, not empty exactly, because the machinery still breathes and hums, but attenuated. A machine running at partial capacity, aware in some mechanical way that it has accomplished what it was built to accomplish and is waiting, with no particular urgency, for what comes next. I sit on the bridge sometimes in the early hours when the rest of the skeleton crew is asleep, and I look at the planet below us. It is blue-green and very large, and it turns slowly, the way planets do, indifferent to whether anyone is watching. Sometimes the Terminator line catches a feature on the northern continent, and for just a moment, it looks like home. It doesn't really. It's not home. It's something else, something that doesn't have a word yet. The children will name it. They will name it, and they will map it, and they will fight about it and build on it and gradually make it into the background of their lives, in the way that humans have always turned landscape into background, habituating themselves to the extraordinary through the simple process of living in it every day, until it stops being extraordinary and becomes merely where they are. And they will raise children who will never have seen it as extraordinary, and those children will raise children who will have forgotten, in the way that each generation forgets the specific texture of the fear that shaped the generation before, how close it came to not existing, how there was a moment, a long, terrible, slow-motion moment that lasted 8 decades, when there was a real possibility that there would be no children at all. No children's children. No children's children's children. I do not begrudge them that forgetting. It is, I think, the correct response to a world that keeps being new. You cannot live with your face turned backward all the time. You cannot inhabit the future while you are still standing in the past. What I hope is that someone keeps the record, that Mara's observatory keeps watching the watchers, and Ellen's biologists keep cataloging the ecosystem, and Asha and her contemporaries keep arguing with each other about what to do next, and that somewhere in all of that, someone writes down what it cost, not in a spirit of guilt or debt, just as an honest accounting. This is what was spent. This is what was saved. This is what was possible, and this is what it took to make it actual. I am 61 years old. I am the last surviving member of the original crew of the generation ship Threshold. In approximately 3 years, when the surface settlement is stable enough, I am going to take one of the remaining descent vehicles down and stand on actual ground for the first time in 40 years, assuming my knees hold out. Ellen has told me that there is a place on the northern coast where the wind comes in off the ocean, and the light in the late afternoon is something she can't quite describe. She says she's been trying to find words for it for 3 years. She says it's the kind of light that makes you stop whatever you're doing and just look. She says she wants to show it to me. I told her I'd be there. The log will remain running. The ship will continue to orbit. The children will continue to do whatever it is that children do when you've handed them a world and stepped back. That was always the plan. That was, from the very beginning, the whole point. We didn't do it to be remembered. We didn't do it to be thanked. We didn't even entirely do it from love, though love was part of it. We did it because we had calculated, with whatever instruments humans use for this kind of calculation, that the outcome justified the cost. That what was possible if we bore the weight of the impossible was worth the weight. That the candle of what we were, the particular human light of us, was worth passing forward even when the hand that held it was about to go dark. The Watchers didn't understand that. They do now, or they have a model of it, which for something like the Watchers is close enough to understanding. They are still watching. Let them watch. We know what we're doing, and we know why, and we have known since the beginning who we were doing it for, even though most of us never met them and never will. The planet is turning below me. The light is coming up on the northern coast. Somewhere down there, in a field that smells like something neither grass nor anything else has a name for yet, a 12-year-old girl named Asha is waking up to a morning that her grandfather made possible by choosing to spend his last hours next to her instead of anywhere else. I think that's enough. I think that's the whole story. It holds.